dealing with research design. We talked last time, in the past few classes, about different aspects of research design. And two of the things that dictate the quality of what you produce is your sample size, how much you dig, and also how you dig, in terms of getting the data, the artifacts that answer your research questions, hopefully. And so your sample size really has a lot of impact over if you can answer your research questions and the type of data you get in answering your research questions, both in terms of how much you can dig, but also in terms of what size of artifacts are you able to examine. If you're only using screen that has, for example, mesh about this big, when you screen the dirt from an excavation, everything smaller than that mesh, about that's an inch across, is going to fall through. You might miss smaller artifacts. So sample size isn't just how much you dig, it's also how you sift for the artifacts. It also determines what you save and what you don't save, and it determines where you dig. Are you using a random sample or a judgmental sample? And your sample size, how much you dig and the amount of effort you put into looking for artifacts, is really dictated by how much budget you have. How many people can you afford to have in the field, and how long can they stay there? So budget ties directly into sample size, how much you can dig and how well you explore for the artifacts. Okay, this is a critical thinking exercise about research design, budget, and sampling. And before we get into this, I want to talk a little bit about random sampling and judgmental sampling. Remember last time I was telling you about predictive modeling, about how you look across the landscape for artifacts, and there's certain locations that have a higher chance of having artifacts reflecting human activity. Other locations, there's less of a chance. And I came up with this hypothetical situation in which you have a water source down here and some hills, and up here is a flat desert. You can only dig in 3 locations. Where are you going to dig? Well, humans tend to live on flat land that's elevated, that has good drainage, and is close to a water source because humans have to drink water. And so if you only have a few places you can dig, you'll probably place most of them down here that's close to that river because that's your water source, right? You might place one up here just to account for the fact that humans do stuff that's not entirely based on survival. They do things for ideological and religious reasons that might say, okay, they value the desert for spiritual connotations, and they might do things up here that aren't necessarily about interacting with the environment on a logical scale in terms of survival, but for other reasons. And so you won't ever find those artifacts at a religious center unless you also explore up here. So you probably put a bulk of your test units down here and a few up there. And so there's 2 different ways you can do this. You can pick locations where you say, okay, here's a nice plateau, it's a huge flat-topped hill, and it's right next to a water source. I'm going to dig there. If you look at the map and say, I'm digging right there, that is a judgmental sample, meaning you have some preconceived notion about where there's going to be the best artifacts. However, if we don't have any of this, if all you have is one big flat desert, and you have absolutely no idea where you want to dig, you might use a random number generator saying, okay, we're going to dig here, here, here. You might throw darts into a map. You might do anything where you don't have any idea about one location being better than another to find an artifact. And so that's a random sample. There's a judgmental sample where you have some preconceived notion about where stuff is in the ground. And you have a random sample where you just say, okay, now I'm just going to dig wherever, maybe on a grid system, which is really judgmental, it's not random. And I've never used an entirely purely random sample. I don't believe in random samples because I always have some preconceived notion about a location that's going to be better than another. And so I don't think there's ever really entirely a proper random sample. I think people always have some subjective bias in terms of where they put your test units, unless you use a computer program that randomly generates points on a map. I guess that is technically a random sample. But whenever I've done archaeology in the past, I've always had at least some preconceived notion about where I want to dig. Now, supposedly in New Orleans, I was supposed to spend 60% of my time on judgmental samples and the other 40% on random samples. So I was like, no. So I said in my research design, okay, I'll do this because that's what the state expected. But really, my quote random samples is someplace in the backyard, but is always conveniently on top of where I suspected there was a privy. And so I never really used a completely random sample. It was always a judgmental sample. I dug in an unlikely location just to see what was there. But if I didn't find anything, I dug an extra pit where I knew something was there. So this is an example of a hypothetical research design where we're going to apply what we know from this information up here to a map. And we're going to go around the room, and each of you have a chance to decide where you want to put a test unit to dig. I know where the stuff is. And so we'll find out at the end how many interpretive points we generate based on our budget. So let's look through this. Okay, a geological survey of the South Pacific island of Otaku has uncovered 7,000-year-old human remains on a mountaintop grave. The grave contained the remains of an adult female along with 5 drilled shark teeth. Because the shark teeth were found with the grave, what does that make those? What's the term for those objects placed with the dead in a mortuary context?
They were food? The sharks were food?
No, not food. They were decorative. So if you wore them like a pendant, they would be grave goods. Very good. They're a type of grave good. National Geographic is funding a preliminary, meaning a survey, the very first one, archaeological survey of Otaku. Your team of archaeologists, the entire class, has been given a budget of 50 grand, which is not a very big budget, to locate and excavate archaeological sites on the island. Although your primary research goal is to locate additional prehistoric burials, things that go back 7,000 years, you're also in charge of finding historical sites across the island. So anything of any type of cultural value should be looked for. You've been given permission from the local government, which is the island of Otaku is part of the Tokelau island chain. And let's flip over briefly to a map showing where the Tokelau Islands are. It's a little bit east of Australia. So here we have Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, and the Tokelau Islands are all the way in the middle here. So the local government has given you permission to do this. That is part of the ethics of this. You just don't go there and say, hey, we're going to do a study. You ask the locals first. Archaeologists in the past, back in the 1900s, in the late 1800s, went to places and dug up artifacts, took them back to Europe, and maybe paid somebody to say, is this okay? And they're like, yeah, sure, it's okay. And that's why there's so many antiquities in museums in the United States and in London and in England and in France and Germany, where the original country they were taken from 100 years ago says, hey, we want that stuff back. You kind of stole it from us. It's being duked out through international courts. So we got permission to do this, to test any part of the island. A preliminary literature review of the Tokelau Islands reveals that there have not yet been any previous archaeological studies. So we do a lit review, we say how much archaeology is taking place here. Archaeologists have been nowhere near the Tokelau Islands, so we have absolutely no previous studies to go by, based on about 10 hours of library research by the team members. Using the budget formula given below, plan how and where you're going to dig, and indicate if you're using a judgmental or biased sample, which means you have some preconceived notion that stuff's going to be there, or a random sample, meaning you just pick a spot randomly on the map. The prehistoric burial was located at map location C3. Now let's zoom in on the map, see what that means. Okay, so here we go. This is a grid system applied over this island. The island's only about a mile across. It's a small island. It's part of the Tokelau island chain. It's the island of Otaku. These are elevation points, so it's a mountain, mountain, and mountain. Here's a little island off to the side. All this on the outside is water. Here is a current day Tokelau fishing village. So there's a city at the main Tokelau island, their capital, But then you have local fishing villages, and this tiny island has one local fishing village. They grow crops. That's what those lines are, those agricultural fields. But primarily it subsists off fishing, so they've lived there their entire lives. Each of these grid locations can be tested with pedestrian survey and intrusive testing using 50 shovel tests. So each of these is squares that's 500 feet across on the side. And if you test it with 50 shovel tests, it's pretty decent coverage. You can space them out once every 10 or 15 meters. And you do a pedestrian survey, you walk across the ground surface. Now, any location that is out in the open, to do this, to dig 50 shovel tests, costs you $5,000. We have a budget of $50,000. But if it's any location that has mountain or jungle, these squiggly lines are trees, jungle, it costs $10,000. We only have $50,000. So immediately you see we can't dig up the entire island. We have to be pretty selective with where we put our test units, because we can maybe dig in 5 of the locations that have jungle or mountaintop. That eats up our entire budget. Or we can dig in 10 locations where it's open area. That's only $5,000. Or we can do a mismatch of the two. Also, we can spend part of our budget doing intensive archival research at the capital of the Tokelau Islands, where they have a university and libraries as part of our research. That only costs $5,000. And we can do oral interviews with the villagers and ask them if they know anything about the island. Recording the oral interviews and hiring translators, that costs $5,000 as well. You only have to do this once, and that canvasses the entire island. So you don't pay $5,000 per grid. You just use up part of your budget once, and that does the entire show. So you can do just digging, or you can do digging plus archival research, or digging plus oral interviews. Of course, this ties into or negates part of how much you can dig. Okay, so let's start in terms of where we're going to dig. Now, mind you, the original burial was found at C3, which is a plateau top. This is a flat area on top of a mountain. That's where that one 7,000-year-old burial was located. This was found by geologists. We could, if we wanted to, go back here because it hasn't been looked at by archaeologists before. So we're going to go around the room, and you're going to tell me your name, so I memorize it, and then where you think we should dig based on this scant amount of evidence. We assume that the team members have some prior experience with the region. No one just ever dug Tokelau Islands before. So, where do you want to dig? Yeah, what's your name?
I'm Allison.
Okay, I'm sorry. And also partially deaf, so just speak of.
Allison.
Allison, okay, Allison. So, where are we going to dig?
It was found at C3.
It was found at C3 just by a team of geologists. They kind of stumbled across it. So no one's ever done a proper survey of C3.
I'm going to go next and do C4.
Okay, you're going to do C4, which is right here. Now, why look at C4?
Because since it's close to it, I'm just assuming there's going to be more around where they are.
Okay, good. It's close or proximal to the original find. It's in this valley floor between the two mountains. And so it's judgmental based on proximity to the original find. Very good. So we have C4, which is in the mountains, and so that takes up $10,000 of our budget. Okay.
I'm Emily,
Emily, yes.
and I was thinking maybe H7 because
H7.
that also kind of has the plateau top like C3 does.
Okay.
So maybe you can see if there's stuff there too.
Okay, good. So you have this preconceived notion that 7,000 years ago, people buried their dead on plateau tops, and so you're looking for similar environments. Okay, that's a perfectly good thing to think, and this other anthropologists would say, yeah, this is good. Maybe things have eroded down over time, so yeah, looking there is fine, and looking here, H7, also a good idea, but it's a plateau top, so that eats up another $10,000 of budget.
Alberto,
Yes.
Well, I'll show you still my idea, but
It is possible to go to this little island over here.
island, but why would I go to the island?
All right.
Many ancient civilizations would value high top places as close to the sun to get, so I'm guessing I'm gonna go with D5 as another mountain top.
Okay, D5 is a mountaintop. It's not a plateau, but it's certainly a mountaintop. So it's an elevation point. They valued elevation
There
points.
may be tunnels there.
Okay, very good. So we do D5, and that costs us 10 grand. So this is C4, D5, and H7. Okay. Where else?
I'm Brian.
Yes.
So I was thinking C8
C-
because maybe the village, the fishing village, their predecessors were moving over there.
Okay, very good. I mean, if this is a point where it's logical to have a fishing village today, then maybe 400 years ago, it made sense to live there to have a fishing village back then. And so, you dig around here, you might find historic evidence of the fishing village. Okay, very good. And that only costs us 5 grand because it's the middle of the open. C8. We're running out of budget before we get to the back of the class. Clear.
No, if there's one burial on C3, I would look more, because there's gonna be more.
Okay, so we go back and we take a look at C3. And so that's 10 grand, very good. And now we spent 45 grand when we have 5 grand left, and where are you gonna dig?
Do you have to dig, or can we do like?
You can do the oral or the archival too.
I think we should do an oral interview.
Okay, so you talk to the locals. We're gonna hire someone who knows English and Tokelauian. I'm assuming that's their regional language. And we're gonna record the oral narratives by talking to the locals. Okay, very good. So we're gonna have 5 grand as oral narratives. Okay, so where is everything? Okay. We'll start off with C3. Further survey here does in fact reveal 2 more graves. So the shell test revealed graves, and the data gives us 2 interpretive points. And we were really close with C4. There's actually a cave site right here that has prehistoric art in it, but we missed it. But it's the right idea of the valley in between the 2 locations. We don't find anything here. At D5, nothing on the mountaintop, but we were right that the plateau tops, H7, has 1 additional grave on it, and that's worth 1 interpretive point. And then we also placed 1 at C8, and we just missed it. There's actually 1 at C9 and B8. But because we talked to the locals, we automatically get those 2 because the farmers say, hey, this is stuff we found in the fields, and they direct us straight to the site. So we get 1 point for having talked to the locals because they tell us the history of the island, as they know. It's an important thing to record in terms of cultural resources. And they automatically take us to these 2 locations. And so we find artifacts from the previous versions of the fishing village, which is a good thing to find. And so, in total, we got, let's see, 1 point here, 1 point here, 1 point for the locals. That's 3. 7 interpretive points. There is additional resources on this plateau over here. The one that's worth 4 points, we missed, but just barely. So 7 points. How does this play out? Your team uncovers a wealth of cultural resources, and National Geographic highlights your efforts in the 1-hour documentary. Yay. I've actually been in 2, but they're kind of pseudo-documentaries. There was Houston's History, the Walter Black. I don't know if he makes those anymore, but okay. And you publish your results in a peer-reviewed journal. Now, it's possible that we could have gone out there and found nothing. If we hadn't talked to the locals and we hadn't done their archival research, we could have just picked parts of the island at random, if we used a random sample, that didn't have any stuff there. And so even though you might have a well-conceived research design, it's always possible to go out someplace and you just miss what's there. I always like to think that I've been kind of lucky with finding stuff. I have been on digs before where we found nada. And then afterwards, after spending 3 months in the field, you go back to the office and you write a 100-page report about finding nothing. That's really irritating. I only stayed with that company for a year. It was like, no, this isn't me. This is not really archaeology. I'm just going out finding nothing so pipelines can be built. Ugh. And so, one of my favorite comic artists is Gary Larson, who writes The Far Side. Have you all read The Far Side? Okay. And he made this comic once where there's this paleontologist on the ground surface, and here is this dead brontosaurus, the form of a fossilized skeleton, and he's dug here, and here, and here, and here. And the caption reads, well, I guess there's nothing there to find. It really just got fabulously unlucky and didn't find the skeleton. That's possible, especially if you use an entirely random sample. Now, publishing your results in a peer-reviewed journal is something that is a good career move, because that's something that looks strong on your curriculum vitae. Do you all know what a CV is as opposed to a resume? Like, you know, a resume is what you do to get a job anywhere. But within academia, in order to move on to a grad school or PhD program or get a job teaching someplace, what you generate is a curriculum vitae, which is just a resume, but it's geared in terms of your academic past. It's geared in terms of what you've done in terms of teaching and research, publications. It's your CV. So it's a special type of resume that you use in academia. And this carries more weight than, say, a non-peer-reviewed journal. A non-peer-reviewed journal is something that people still read, is popular perhaps, but peer-reviewed means that before it gets published, a panel of other specialists in your field will look at what you wrote and tell the editors, hey, this is worthy of being published in your journal. And so it carries more weight to it. A peer-reviewed means your peers have looked at your stuff before it gets published, and they pass it by this panel of other professors. It's kind of a popularity game because of that. Part of this, in terms of getting it rejected or accepted, is based on the strength and weight of what you write. And also part of it is, hey, you know, they're friends of mine, and so they pass it. So it is part popularity game, and it is part based on the scientific merit of what you write. I've done this a couple of times. Non-peer-reviewed journals is things like Archeology magazine, which is something that's kind of a popular press sort of thing. You find it in Barnes and Nobles and the magazine racks. And it has scientific articles in it, but it's not peer-reviewed. And the type of things that get published in there, some academics don't think it has any type of scientific merit to it, and they kind of laugh at it. I was talking to a colleague a few nights ago, and she was actually complaining about Nat Geo and the things that they publish. And she says, you know, that's pretty bad. I said, yeah, I was in Archeology magazine once, like 10 years ago. She said, oh my God, that's about as bad as the National Enquirer. I was like, yeah, you're right. And then beneath that, there's technical reports that are publicly accessible, and so they count as publications, but they're not any type of journal article that's read by other academics per se, or by the masses, by the public. So they have the least cachet. I've written about 100 of these. If they count as 0.01 of a publication, I still get a publication out of it. It's just I've done easily 100 technical reports for various entities. Things that get part of a federal library or archived someplace, they'll get used for academic reasons, but it doesn't count as much as a peer-reviewed journal. Now what we did get is the maximum number of fines, which would have netted us $200,000 of grant money. It's always fantastic to get grant money, because it's kind of like a momentum snowball sort of thing. Somebody thinks you're worthy of getting money, other people are too. So as soon as you have like 4 or 5 grants behind you, it's more likely to get additional grants, because new grant sources see your resume, your academic CV, and they say, oh look, National Science Foundation has given them money, the Brown Foundation has, all these other people have given them money, they must be worthy of it. So they're more inclined to give you money for your research from having previously received grant money. So it's a momentum sort of effect. Okay. But you all did good. You all made it somewhere in the middle. At least we didn't find nothing. And we didn't get everything, but you can't always find everything. Unless you're me and you dug up New Orleans for 5 years, I found everything on those city blocks. Some days we spent 3 or 4 days on one property, and we would literally upturn the entire property. There's once an occasion where we didn't find the privy the first day, we didn't find the privy the second day, and my crew was like, what are we still doing here? It's like, well, they had to go potty someplace. And so we literally dug up the entire property, all 100 by 50 feet of it. And the very last day, the very last shovel test, we found the privy. Okay. Oh, and a funny little story attached to this. When I made this up as a worksheet, this was back in 2000 or 2003. Now, this isn't what the island looks like. This is totally D&D style, made a map for the sake of doing an in-class exercise. But I wanted to attach it to something historic, right? So I picked an island at random on the map and said, okay, I'll call it Tokelau. So I'm doing this in a class at U of H. There's 100 students, and the entire class does, and they have fun. And afterwards, this girl comes up and says, oh, this is great, and it was really instructive, but my homeland looks nothing like this. She was actually from the Tokelau Islands. So like, oh. So I changed the name of the island from a Tofu to a Taku, so that wouldn't happen again, right? But what are the odds? Okay, what I want to do now is talk a little bit about experimental archaeology. Now, experimental archaeology is whenever we try to create today processes that we assumed would have gone on in the past. So, whenever you see on a documentary workers in Egypt quarrying stone, cutting out this huge 20-ton block of stone, dragging it across the desert and setting it in place as if they're building one of the pyramids, the reason why they're doing that today is to understand how were the pyramids built, but also more importantly, how many person-hours of energy went into the construction of these buildings. And when you do this, you have this idea of how many person-hours and how much power the elites had and how many workers they had to have had over a certain length of time. It gives them a better idea about the nature of the structures. This has been done all across the planet. It's been done with Stonehenge. And it's a type of experimental archaeology because they're recreating today using what they assume is a technology that existed thousands of years ago, the building of these structures. You can do this with anything, any aspect of the past. You can do recreations today. And this gives us this window, this understanding to the past of how things might have been done, how much effort it would have taken, how much physical skill and dexterity. A really good example of this is when I was in California at that inland naval base just outside of Death Valley, the town I was living in was called Ridgecrest, and they hired an artist to put in the center of the city in this park all these stone monoliths with prehistoric petroglyphs on them. They wanted to recreate petroglyphs in their public park that existed on the military base. And so this artist started working on these huge stones they put up in the park. And he had the tools that would have existed thousands of years ago that the prehistoric Native Americans would have had access to. So he was scratching on these big rocks with stone. And I was like, oh, that's cool. How long do you think this is going to take you? He says, well, you know, they've given me a month to make these pieces of art. He says, I think this will just take me a day. So I go to work that day. I come back out the next day, and he's still on that same art piece. It was only halfway done. I'm like, wow. He says, yeah, it's harder than it looks. I come out a week later, he only has 2 of those monoliths completed. He needs to do 12. And like, you're not going to complete on time, are you? He's like, no. He says, but I think I'm going to get better at it as we go along. I go out there the next week, and he's only on number 3, but he pulls out a hammer and a chisel. I'm like, isn't that cheating? He's like, yeah, well, I got to get this stuff done. But him doing that and understanding how much effort it takes to make a petroglyph was a type of experimental archaeology, because that gave me an idea of the amount of energy and investment it took the Native Americans, the Coastal Indians of Central California, to make those pieces of art. So that's the type of experimental archaeology. Another one is where in Louisiana, it wasn't my project, it was another team member's project. There's this one location where they had built thousands of years ago, a big earthwork mound. So it's like a pyramid made of earth. There's a big hill. This is Native Americans from southern Louisiana. But they had laid out 10 feet of river cane as the foundation to this gigantic hill, which is interesting into itself. Why lay out a 10-foot deep foundation of river reeds when you're going to make an earthen hill anyways? And just as an aside, the reason why I think they did this is because they used woven mats of the same river cane in burials when they buried their dead, and that separated the body in the spiritual level from the earth, from other forces. And so it provided a certain level of spirituality in that burial context. And I think the same idea applies here because it's the same river cane. They were separating this mountain from the rest of the earthly plane, giving a certain elevated spirituality. But the team member who was working on this project, it wasn't a hill when he got out there, a lot of it was chopped away. So I want to preserve some of this river cane. It's dissolving as soon as we get it out of the ground because it was in highly acidic soil. It was only because it was 10 feet thick that there were pieces of it left. And he realized that as soon as he removed that stuff, it's going to start dissolving. So you come up with a special way of preserving this river cane. And so I went to a conference that month about preserving artifacts, and it was an archaeologist from Texas A&M University, Dr. C. Wayne Smith, who'd come up with a technique for preserving organic artifacts from thousands of years ago by removing the water from the cell structure and replacing it with plastics, with polymers. And so I talked to him a bit. He said, I'll send you the chemicals. You let me know how it works on your river cane. It took a while for the chemicals to get there, but eventually they did. I used this technique, and it really did provide some structure to the dissolving vegetation, and it gave it a longer lifespan. And so his technique worked, but me applying his new patent-pending type of artifact conservation to artifacts that had never been tested on before was a type of experimental archaeology too, because it's using a new technology in a new way, in this case to help preserve the past. And those segments of river cane are now in the warehouse someplace in Louisiana, so ostensibly future researchers can examine them as well. It'd be interesting, for example, to see if the way they wove it together, because they cross-hatched it, matches the way the mats looked in the burials that they uncovered for that Native American population in South Louisiana. Another example of experimental archaeology is later this month, it's not October yet, but maybe at the end of October on Halloween, or beginning of November, I'll take a small group of students with masks, PPEs, social distancing to Olivet Cemetery. And the idea is that we're going to use a GoPro camera on the end of a painter stick, and we're going to put it down the well at Olivet, and it's going to be on a Wi-Fi system, so it's going to send images of what it sees to a big iPad display we have at the surface, and we're going to record it as a way of exploring the well, which is also, because I don't think it's ever been done before, going to be a type of experimental archaeology. Okay, now let's take a look. Oh, no, there's one more. And Daniel and Claire were out there when we were doing this last spring. One of my students last spring came up with a specialized way of dealing with heavy clay in terms of screening it. Sometimes you're digging down so far, the soil we get into is this really thick clay. And when it gets wet, it's impossible to push through the screen. Sand and silt and other soils go through an archaeological screen like that. But clay, you push it through, it comes out like Play-Doh. It's really hard to find artifacts in it. And so he actually used a salad spinner in a bucket of water. We put the clay inside that, and we spun it around, and we smushed it around. The water helped break down the clay. And by using this technique, we're able to find really tiny artifacts in the soil. And that was definitely an experimental way of increasing our sample in terms of archaeological screening. And by doing this, we found tiny little bits of shotgun shell pellets that had been, probably they were hunting animals, shot, they missed, or hit the animal partially. The other pellets in it ended up going to the ground. we wouldn't find shotgun pellets unless we had used this technique. We completely would have missed them with archaeological screens. What I want to do now is show you a short 15-minute-ish video about experimental archaeology. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause it after a few minutes after you show one example. We'll talk about what we just saw, then we'll watch another example. But it's a great example of different types of experimental archaeology. I want to take a look at that video. It's from an experimental park, in a way, up in the Netherlands. Oh, that story I related to y'all last time about my team member in China Lake, California, near Death Valley, Seth, and how he wanted to climb those mountain slopes because he thought possibly there was something at the top. And we actually found something on the very last day after all that climbing. That was also experimental archaeology in terms of thinking through experimentally predictive modeling and where there might or might not be prehistoric and ancient Native American sites. Okay, so this video is called Challenges of the Past, Experimental Archaeology in Lyre. And we'll be watching part of it, and I'll be pausing it, and we'll talk about, as a class, discussing the merits of the experiment they were trying to conduct, and really if they would reveal anything instrumental about the past.
The past makes us curious. We wonder about life then. What was it like? Were people like us? Were they curious too, and did they wonder about the world around them? We are interested in the people of the past because they are our ancestors, and we sense that they must have been like us. Humans use trial and error in order to understand. Humans experiment. In Land of Legends in Lyra, we do exactly the same thing. We examine and try to understand the people of the past and the conditions in which they lived. The people of the past were always changing the world about them by taking up new opportunities and making technological progress. And we are constantly changing the way we understand their world. We are continually rediscovering the past in our own ways, for we can never arrive at the absolute truth about the past. For most of the 100,000 years in which we humans have been producing tools, the most important raw material was flint. So research into flint implements and experiments carried out into their use and manufacture are the key to help us to understand many aspects of the way people lived in the past. Flint snapping is a craft that became extinct and now has to be rediscovered. In Land of Legends in Lyre, many researchers from home and abroad have taken part in these experiments. One American researcher has devoted most of his life to trying to become just as good as the craftsmen of ancient times. And one thing he does is to reproduce the beautiful flint daggers familiar from the end of the Stone Age and the beginning of the Bronze Age.
It wasn't until I came over to Denmark and looked at the originals rather than just pictures in the book that I turned them over and see three-dimensionally just how complicated they were and beautiful. And the more I did, the more complicated they seemed to be. So 25 years later, I occasionally come close, but I don't know that I'm even good enough to fit into a Neolithic society if I were there.
Flint knapping is a very complicated craft. The large flint block, the core, is attacked systematically. Every strike is carefully planned and thought through, like a chess player planning his next move. You can hit the block directly with another harder stone, or hit it indirectly. Then the strike is transmitted through a short point made of antler. We should admire the craftsmen of ancient times. It takes years of practice for a modern craftsman before he can knack flint as well as they did.
What's important here, beyond the fact that they're trying to recreate today stone tools that existed thousands of years ago, is understanding the amount of those tiny little flakes are being knocked off that one core in order to make a stone dagger or a spear tip or whatever tool they're going for. He's going to end up with hundreds and hundreds of those little bits of stone to make one tool. And so if you have a village there and you have people living there making these stone tools generation after generation, the entire soil around their village is going to get thickly carpeted and walk down to the soil with all of those flakes. And so again, we talked about this last week, the #1 hallmark in archaeology that you're around a human habitation place where it goes back to prehistoric times, is that you almost always first find this thick lens of these stone flakes. I remember finding this up in New York State where there's a village site, and about 3 feet down, the soil is mostly stone flakes and only a little bit of soil. And this is what we found, shovel test after shovel test, across the area the size of a football field, where these stone flakes about 3 feet down, because Native Americans have been living there for hundreds of years, and it just filled up in the ground.
If you want to investigate methods of craftsmanship, for example, you need to be good enough to know what was possible at the time. A few of our modern researchers and flint knappers have become specialists and experts, just like the flint masters of ancient times.
This large blade core is now ready to give blades. Let's look at it. It has a large platform. It's organized with 2 front rests and the back rest.
The flint knapping session is part of the series of experiments that will show how blades up to 30 to 40 centimeters long could be produced in the Neolithic age. Just like the flint daggers, they're among the very finest examples of flint craftsmanship.
So the documentation consists in taking notes and describing these different series using a data sheet system for each one, and also using microphotos.
A researcher has to be...
So each of those blades can then be modified into something else. So each of those is either in certain populations an arrowhead or a knife or an awl. So those are kind of like the basic widgets of stone tool technology. It's making those long blades. That's not the end result. They didn't actually use those per se. Those are the things they made into knives and other tools. But sometimes you encounter a campsite where you find a dozen of those long blades. That wasn't the actual tool. Somebody was carrying around with them their raw material or semi-processed stone, because they didn't know what they wanted to make yet, but they wanted the work to be halfway done. So sometimes prehistoric peoples would carry around what's called a blank, and a blank is a partially made tool. They can finish in any number of ways. And so that's what those are. Those are technically blanks, like planks of wood, that haven't been really built in anything yet, but they've been partially processed.
Good enough at his craft if he's to ask the right questions about other ways the blades could have been made. Might there have been a Stone Age machine, for example, capable of transferring and increasing the force with which the central strike point in the core was hit? There's no reason to believe that people living in the Stone Age did not have experience with laws of physics such as the transmission of force. We observe the results of fantastic craftsmanship, the working processes of which we've only gradually begun to rediscover. Working with experimental tools creates signs of usage called wear traces. These can be compared to the wear traces on original ancient flint tools. This allows us to confirm or dispel the likelihood of a usage proposed for a particular ancient tool. The experiment being carried out here is aimed at finding an explanation for a special type of small flint scrapers. They've been found in large quantities and have characteristic small-toothed long sides. What was this tool used for? In order to find the answer, copies of this flint tool have been reproduced, and the copies are now being used in the processing of different plants. By scraping the stem of the stinging nettle, it's possible to loosen fibre, which can later be used for making cloth.
The most exciting part is taking these tools back to the laboratory and looking down the edges onto the surface to see that actually they are a promising match for the archaeological pieces that we find. Whatever these tools are, they're used for a very long time, and a lot of people in a wide area of Europe are using them.
And what they were doing right there is also called micro-wear analysis. Micro-wear analysis. Sometimes the marks that end up on stone tools isn't visible to the naked eye. You have to look at it under a magnifying glass or a microscope, and that can tell you how the tool is used. So in this case, maybe for plant fibers to be made into woven cloth.
Dolmens and passage graves were built 5,500 years ago by Denmark's earliest agricultural population. The question which naturally arises is how on earth they could have managed to move such large stones. When we look more closely at both dolmens and passage graves, we see that they are covered by huge capstones which form the ceiling of the grave chamber. Pulling large stones over long distances is actually not that hard. All you need is enough manpower. It's much more difficult to understand how Stone Age people were able to position these heavy stones, weighing up to as much as 20 tons, with such precision. Levers were used for the handling of a megalith, which would gradually be levered higher and higher, while wedges were constantly placed under it. The last part is the most difficult. Here it's possible to use an A-trestle, which is an ingenious method of utilizing the principle of leverage. A rope is attached to the top of the stone, and this rope is connected to the crossbeam of the A-trestle. At the top of the trestle is another rope, which is then pulled, thereby creating a force at the top of the A-trestle, which makes it easier to raise the megalith to an upright position.
Yeah! Free, pull! Yeah, very fine. Hold it there. A little more. 1, 2, 3, pull! Yeah, that's it.
The large capstone of the dolmen weighs approximately 9 tons. The Danish king Frederick VII was the first to propose a method where the stone could be drawn up to the top of the mound via an earthen slope.
Okay, so this is interesting. You're recreating the amount of person hours of energy and just the number of people it would take to make these ancient structures. In this case, a large stone burial mound. But what would you critique about this experiment if they wanted to say, okay, it took 80 people 6 hours to make this foundation for this burial mound? What would you critique about that, based on what you're seeing right here? What do you think is a flaw if they came up with the equation saying 80 people, X number of hours?
Takes a lot of time.
Yeah, it takes a lot of time, but
not accurate procedures, because Paleolithic people will be more fit.
okay, well, interesting. So it is a matter of fitness. It's a matter of did they have the same energy levels? Did we have more energy levels today than people back then? Are they more fit? Okay, that's something to think about. What else can you think about? Yes.
I kind of doubt they would have had women doing these.
Okay, interesting. So division of labor in terms of sexes. Was this a community affair, or was it based on just one sex or both? That's interesting. Also, whenever I see this, I'm like, okay, if this was 5,000 years ago, and you're building something for your king who's dead, and the next king in line succession is saying, we have to build this structure for my dad, everyone pull in together, like your lives depend on it, and maybe puts an emphasis like your lives depend on it, then you're really going to put in a lot of energy. These people are kind of laughing. At the end of the day, nothing's going to happen to them if they don't get it built. But if you're a slave or a servant building the pyramids, or if you're somebody building this religious structure, and it's a really, really important society, you're probably going to put more effort into it, more backbone. They're probably going to get beer at the end of the day, so it's less of a thing. And so I'm thinking, it's accurate up to an extent, but they're not putting their entire work behind building the structure. So the equation they came up with, 80 people, X number of hours, I always think to myself, oh, back then it probably required less because people back then are putting a lot more effort into it, perhaps.
We do not have sledges preserved in archaeological finds, but if we travel around the world and observe how primitive peoples move large stones, we know that they use sledges. It took 80 people to pull this large 9-ton capstone all the way up the hill, up the slope, and then up onto the top of the grave chamber. This tells us that the people who were found in the grave chambers were able to gather many others to help them build a monument for themselves or for their kin. And suddenly such a building project is no longer just a monument for the dead, but also for the event that it must have been to build a burial mound. You can imagine that word was spread about the large dolmen in Lyra for a long time after it had been built. It would have been an event where a feast was held as a celebration of the raising of the stones and the building of a monument for the lineage of those who stood for its creation. This is what can be told from the accounts we have of primitive peoples, especially in Indonesia, where graves quite similar to our local Stone Age graves were built all the way up to the First World War. Experiment is a word that makes us think of laboratories and natural science subjects such as physics and chemistry. Many archaeological experiments are actually conducted in close cooperation with other areas of science. One example is a series of experiments done on the construction of the large mounds from the Bronze Age. Some of the mounds were built in such a way that the dead, who were buried more than 3,000 years ago, were preserved with their clothing and burial gifts. The Ekved girl is one such case, as are other burial mound peoples such as the find from Borum Esai. They were preserved due to the oxygen-depleted environment at the center of the mound. By building a number of small mounds in Lyra, it was discovered that during the construction process, large amounts of water were probably added to the innermost regions once the salt had been stacked closely around the coffin. This could have been one of many rituals performed while the mound was being built. A total of 4 different models of Bronze Age mounds were built in Lyra to a scale of 1 to 4 and 1 to 5. Developments in the soil environment of the mound were measured, and to see how this affected preservation, sides of pork and entire piglets were buried in oak coffins in the mounds. We are starting with a piece of leather placed at the head with a bit of yarrow beside it. Then we have a piece of bronze on the piglet, along with a piece of amber, which has been broken in half.
Okay. So it's interesting how they're using pigs in this, but pigs are the best stand-in for people in terms of doing experimental forensic archaeology. I have this experiment that I want to do where I lay a pig out in that field just north of the fire station and put a little wire cage over it and let it decompose. And then every evening I'll have the geographer, Buck, fly his drone over it with a thermal camera and take a picture of the decomposing pig. Why do this? Why do this weird experiment? Because my idea, my hypothesis, is that even though when something dies, its body reaches the ambient temperature of the outside relatively quickly, maggots, when they infest the body, will generate heat. And that the thermal signature of a decomposing pig, if we use this as stand-in for a person, will be something that's registerable by a drone flying over it using a thermal camera. And maybe this could be a way of detecting murder victims in like a state park or desert or open field. And so they're using a pig because the pig's the best type of animal you can use as a stand-in for a person. Now why do you suppose they're putting the leather and the amber and the bronze inside this MIGDU coffin? The reason why they're doing this is they want to test why these burial mounds that have sod on top of them provide such a good preservation context. They almost have like mummification inside these mounds. But why do that? Why put those objects in with the pig?
Maybe that was found in other burials.
It was found in other burials, exactly. So they're taking into account the possibility, the slight possibility, that there's some chemical reaction behind the artifacts being next to the flesh, and that lending to preservation. Just like we know that bodies that are in dry sand, the sand wicks away the moisture from the body, and in Egypt and other locations, like the Xinjiang in South China, provides mummification. So they're saying, well, in addition to these oxygen-deprived environments of these sod mounds that they buried people in that made a certain level of mummification, maybe it's also the stuff alongside the body. So they're actually recreating grave goods, and they're putting them in with the pigs to see what happens. And what we'll see in this video is that this has been going on for a long time. They jump forward a few years and they dig back up these caskets, these logs with the pigs in them, to see the state of decomposition of the pig. So this is a longitudinal study that goes on for years and years.
Finally, we lay a piece of woolen cloth like that of the egg-bed girl. Years later, the mounds were excavated. The side of pork was so well preserved that at least by scientific standards it was still edible. However, the piglets were more decomposed. The experiments on the construction of the mounds were the beginning of a major research project, including many other methods. One result was the
Okay, now this is just an odd, stray question, but okay, you have a pork chop in there, and you have a whole piglet. The piglet's going to end up more decomposed than the side of meat. Why do you think that's true? Because if they're being preserved because it's an oxygen-depleted environment, also known as an anaerobic environment where microbes can't do their thing because there's none of this oxygen in the air, why would the pig decompose further than the side of meat?
Maybe the moisture?
Yeah, it has moisture, it has liquids in it, and it has air pockets inside of it. So even though it's an oxygen-depleted environment, it's going to decompose quickly because of that.
Wouldn't the bacteria in like their stomach?
Yeah, exactly. You already have bacteria existing in there, and they have this little capsule of space with air in it and other materials, liquids to feast off of. So it's going to start the decomposition process. Whereas the side of meat is put in an anaerobic environment, it has less to work with in terms of decomposition. So that's interesting. And that's exactly what I discovered on a tangential way about capped privies and wells in New Orleans. Whenever you have a deep pit structure that's filled with water and people seal it over with clay, that creates kind of like this, an anaerobic environment. And that's why in New Orleans, whenever I dug up a well from 150 years ago, and it had been capped over with clay, so water and air couldn't get into it, it made an oxygen-depleted environment. And leather items like shirts and boots were still relatively intact. And so it's the same sort of thing, or a similar thing.
excavation of Skelhoy, a large protected barrow near Congo. This burial mound was probably built by hundreds of people organized into building teams. Behind the construction of the mound lies a definite architectural idea, and not least, great organizational and technical knowledge. The experiments at Lyra have taught us more about the mound building practices of the Bronze Age people. We've learned that the actual grave was not the only important thing, but also, to a great extent, the way in which the mound was constructed. Leitra, the Iron Age village, we've shown how we believe houses looked and were laid out about 2,000 years ago. The organisation of the village, the individual buildings, and the details of their construction are a three-dimensional model. In archaeological digs, traces are found of the posts of the houses by way of filled holes in the ground. And from these traces, we've attempted to build a house as a dwelling for humans and animals. In 1967, an experiment was conducted in Lyra to see whether the way in which we built houses in Lyra was at all comparable to that of the original houses. On the morning of the 9th of August, one of the Iron Age houses was set alight. The blaze spread quickly from a large fire in the hearth to a wooden drying shelf and thence to the roof. The peak of the roof is sinking slowly down. Now the whole eastern end of the house is crashing down, and the hole in the eastern end of the house is blocked. The rafters are sticking out, almost like the ribs of a whale. They're sticking out more and more, and not yet burnt up. It's very interesting to see this. After 15 minutes, the whole roof caves in. 20 minutes later, the entire supporting wooden structure collapses, and after approximately an hour, the house is just a smoking ruin. The house was burnt down to create a snapshot of a situation also familiar in ancient times. In 1992, 25 years after the burning of the house, the site of the fire was excavated. Burning a reconstructed house showed us what happened during the fire itself. By excavating the site afterwards, it was possible to make a direct comparison with archaeological sites of burnt houses. But what was life like in houses like these? For 3 winters, a group of archaeology students spent 2 weeks at a time in the houses in the village of Leitra. The group gathered information on temperature, draught, smoke, and other measurable conditions. From excavations, we know that the eastern end of the house was arranged as a stable. But why did they choose to have humans and animals living under the same roof? Our housing experiment showed that it didn't make a difference as far as the heating of the house was concerned. The experiment shook our often idyllic picture of a past with its cosy houses. Our measurements also showed that the indoor climate of the houses was very poor. A number of hazardous substances in the smoke from the fireplace meant that in some places there was air pollution comparable to heavy rush hour traffic. Which sword is best? Back in the Iron Age, weapons were also constantly being improved with the help of new technological discoveries. The raw material bog iron ore was available from many Danish bogs. When bog iron ore is dug up, it's very hard, and initially it's roasted over a fire. After this, it's melted in a furnace. In the oven for the extraction of iron, charcoal is used, and it's the flue gases from the charcoal that react with the ore in such a way that iron is formed. In contrast to modern blast furnace methods, iron is formed in these ovens as solid iron. The iron does not melt at any point in the process. What you can see flowing out of the oven is molten slag. Slag melts at approximately 1200 degrees Celsius, and when you blow with a pair of bellows, you can reach a temperature of approximately 1400 degrees Celsius in the oven, which gives the slag a heat reserve which allows it to flow away from the oven. The iron itself remains in the oven as a solid mass called the bloom. Contrary to what many people believe, bog iron ore is quite a good quality of ore, with the iron content in the best types to be somewhere between 50 and 60% pure iron. In Lyra, we've held seminars on the extraction of iron, where researchers and experts from many countries have shared their experience and knowledge. There are many processes before you have a finished product. After extraction, the iron bloom must be cleansed and then finally forged. All processes leave traces and waste products which show up in archaeological finds. The waste products from each process are registered. This gives us a better background upon which to suggest where and how the same activities were undertaken in ancient settlements. In Denmark, the local bog iron ore was used for iron implements. Many other goods, for example glass and bronze, were traded for with other Germanic tribes or with the Romans. Experiments have given us a way of determining where implements of iron came from. Their origins are revealed by the small residue of slag encrusted in the iron, which can tell us where the iron was originally extracted. This also tells us about ancient trading routes.
Second finishing operation with petting.
Shards from broken clay pots are the most common finds at archaeological excavations. Vessels, cups, serving dishes and other containers of clay have been important to human beings in all times. Many experiments are done to see how we can extract more knowledge from the many broken and crushed shards.
Here we have the following archaeological problem. We found a lot of ceramics from the 4th millennium BC in Jordan, and they all present very different surface features. So the experiment here is the following. We're going to try to find out exactly according to which finishing techniques these different surface features have been made. And for this, we're going to have an experimental process where only one parameter will change at a time. This parameter can be the type of clay. We change the dimension of the enclosures. It can be the amount of water. It can be the tool itself. And it can be also the state of dryness of the clay when it is worked on.
Whether the vessel was fired in an open fire or in an oven may also make a difference, so we test both methods. While the clay objects are being fired, their temperature is measured carefully to allow us to describe the importance of the firing process for the vessel's final appearance. Researchers know how the finished experimental clay objects have been produced, how they've been polished, and how they were fired. Their appearance can then be compared with the appearance of shards from archaeological finds.
We have to go back to the archaeological places and check out the...
It's also possible to suggest how the original vessel was made, and thereby reveal the methods used by the potter. Craftsmen of today are akin to those of ancient times. A skilled craftsman knows what works and what does not. This is knowledge which has been stored through many years of experience in the craftsman himself, and which cannot always be put into words. This is knowledge of the hand, or unspoken knowledge. Many of the best archaeological experiments are therefore conducted by a highly skilled craftsman and an archaeologist working together. From prehistoric Denmark, we have a unique collection of Iron Age and Bronze Age clothing. In Lyra, we've reconstructed many of these known examples of clothing over the years. Some of the garments were made using a drop spindle and on an upright loom. From archaeological finds, we have examples of walkways. The dress worn by the Ekbed girl is one of the oldest known to us. Maybe it was worn in connection with ritual dance. Here are other Bronze Age costumes from oak coffins. Jaunty Iron Age warriors. The beautiful blue women's clothing found in a grave on Luna Heath in western Jutland. The Tolland man with his rope and his cap. He was sacrificed to the gods in the bog. A rich young Viking woman with large ornaments. A happy family in the Viking Age. and a medieval wanderer. In Land of Legends in Lyra, we try to put a series of small experiments into a larger picture. Many apparently small and unimportant questions about very specific prehistoric phenomena are a necessary part of the scientific cognitive process.
These have very little wood left on them. They come off the stems really clean. It's nice. So I'm back again at Lyra, doing the final part of the process. This time we're trying to make things and take it all the way through to producing small samples of artifacts that might have been those that were available in prehistory. We're making, first of all, the metal into fine fibre.
What might seem at first glance to be elementary and very down to earth can, in the twinkle of an eye, turn out to be the key to a spectacular cognitive revelation. Humankind in the past and the present are connected through our common curiosity and creativity. By investigating the past, we become a little wiser about ourselves and the world about us.
I love experimental archaeology. Now, they were talking about pottery earlier. You can do a lot with prehistoric and ancient pottery. You can look at the stuff that went into the clay to give it a different texture, maybe a different strength to the pottery, maybe a different temperature which would fire and harden. But what else do you think you can look at, explore, that's going to be on the inside of clay pots? What else might be left behind that can tell you about if it was a male's role to make the pottery or a woman's role to make the pottery? What evidence can be left on the clay pot that can tell you about the different sexes?
Finger molds?
Yeah, finger molds. Fingerprints.
Fingerprints.
Recently in Spain, they found prehistoric cave art where it was handprints and cave art pressed on the cave walls, and they found fingerprints. And of course, you have sexual dimorphism in the human species. Men on general are bigger than women. And so they looked at the size of the fingerprints to determine if it was a male or female making the artwork. And in ancient Mayan civilization, they discovered these tiny clay masks that were used ritually, that you would make them, and on a religious holiday, you'd break them. And so they didn't spend a long time finishing the inside of the mask. They decorated the outside of it, but the inside was kind of rough. And you can see all these thumbprints on it. It was really fascinating. I read this one article where an archaeologist was able to demonstrate how the masks were originally made by women. But within, when that religious ritual gained importance, it was co-opted by the male craftspeople, and they started making them instead. And you can actually see that transition over time based on the size of the fingerprints on the inside of the masks. And after having read that, when I was in New Orleans, on that one project I told you about earlier, that huge earthwork mound with a 10 feet thick pad of woven river cane at the bottom of it, they found tons and tons of pottery mixed in with the sand, with the soil in the mound. And so we had about a sample of 3,000 bits of pottery that go back thousands of years ago in South Louisiana. And so I told my crew in the lab when they were analyzing the pottery, I said, okay, pay special attention to the inside of each potsherd and see if you can find a fingerprint in there, because it'd be fascinating if we can do a study on the size of the fingerprints or the number of different artisans, because each fingerprint's unique, that actually made this pottery. And it turned out it was kind of a null hypothesis. It was worthy to look for, but we only found 3 potsherds that had fingerprints on them of the 3,000 pieces we had. So I couldn't make any type of sweeping statement about the fingerprints. We would need a few hundred in order to do that. But that's an example of experimental archaeology. Topic heading projects, your project idea, and feel free to email me with questions about your project idea too. We want to have those absolutely in place this week, because it happens every year that it's like a landslide where the semester, the further it goes, the quicker along it gets. And so at this point, we really need to be in place with what you want to do for your research project at the end of the semester. And if you want to, the midterm can be part of you producing your research project. It could be a substantial component of it, like the annotated bibliography of sources that feeds into your final research project, or it could be anything else. If you have a personal goal academically, like you want to explore different academic departments to apply to next year, if you're at the point where you want to get into a 4-year program, or if you've already been admitted to a 4-year program, but you haven't applied to a lot of different scholarships, your midterm project could literally be applying to 10 scholarships and having me help you with the application package. Anything like that, it could be individualized, okay? Or it could be a component of your end of the semester research project. But let's talk about your individualized projects after you pick your end of the semester research project goal. And I'll see you all next time.